Well, hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world. Welcome to our session, Honing Our Capacity as Leaders. Please note, closed captioning is available and can be enabled at the bottom of your Zoom screen. My name is Sarah Borgman, and I'm a senior advisor at Philanthropy Together. I'm a white female, and I identify as she, her. I'm wearing a brown and tan polka dot shirt, which might be nicer than that sounds. And my background is the We Give Summit logo with sparkly white stars on a blue background. So if you haven't joined us in previous sessions, welcome. Philanthropy Together is a global initiative to grow and strengthen the field of collective giving with programming like the We Give Summit. Now, I bet we all believe we are good listeners or that we try really hard. Today, we'll learn from experts and those with earned wisdom on how to polish those skills if you are indeed a great listener. And for the rest of us, we'll get a better definition of what it takes to deeply listen to our peers, program partners, donors, all of your stakeholders. So throughout this session, please engage with us on the chat, which I think you're already doing, which is great. We also encourage you to share your feedback following the session by completing our 2-question poll. Before we get started, I wanted to share that we will be doing a random drawing of one attendee who is right here, right now, to receive a book of their choice from one of this year's speakers. They are amazing. The winner will be announced at the end of the session, so stay with us to see if you've been selected. With that, I'm happy to introduce today's moderator, Lindsay Louie, from the Fund for Shared Insight, who will kick us off today. Welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you. As Sarah said, my name is Lindsay Louie. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with red hair in a ponytail, wearing a purple sweater and against a red backdrop. I'm eager to introduce the session, and I know I'm going to learn as much or more than I'm going to offer here today. So let's dive right in. As you all saw in the description, as you chose this session, the collective action that it's going to take to solve the systemic problems in our society around the world, it's going to require trust. It's going to require surfacing new ideas, and it's going to require hearing voices that have often been unheard due to systemic racism and other inequities in our society. And key to building the trust for all of this, kind of foundational to all of that, is high quality listening. So this session is all about how we can be better listeners and hone that capacity to listen, and in turn build trust and enable better work. Now, there are lots of ways to think about listening, and I'm really excited to talk with Ajay and David about what some of those are. At the very personal level, there are kind of the individual mindsets and actions that we take to be good listeners, all the way to the systems that we set up in our organizations and the expectations that we have around what kind of listening we do in our work. And there are even implications for things like the budgets that we set. It won't be a surprise to any of you that most of the time, while listening does lead to better outcomes, it also takes more time and more money than not budgeting to listen. So there are some systematic or systemic choices like that to make in your work that can help to enable better listening. I have the privilege of being a program director with Fund for Shared Insight, which is a national funder collaborative that seeks to improve philanthropy by promoting high quality listening and feedback in service of greater equity. I'm joined today by Ajay Dahiya, who serves as the managing director for philanthropy at Synergos. Ajay was born in India and grew up in diverse environments on the outskirts of London. And he found real drive and desire in serving others. A deep spiritual calling led him to become a monk in his late teens, where he spent almost a decade in service, spiritual practice, and deep reflection on how to realize a healthy, equal, and just society. Then he transitioned out of monastic life to apply his commitment to service and his belief in the power of catalyzing change agents to lead a number of different mission-driven organizations. He is committed to challenging the status quo and is deeply driven by the simple yet impactful concept that uplifting the world is dependent on uplifting human consciousness. So you can see the connections to high quality listening there, and I'm really eager for what Ajay has to share with us. Synergos, that he represents, is a global organization that has pioneered the use of bridging leadership, which builds trust and collaboration to solve complex problems. We're also joined by David Onick, the CEO of SV2, the Silicon Valley Social Venture Fund. David has worked in the social sector, government, and private sector for 3 decades and brings a deep commitment to equity and social justice as well. He was previously executive director of Northern California's Innocence Project, deputy director for San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom's Office of Criminal Justice, and the justice director at a mission-driven consulting firm called Resource Development Associates. SV2 is a membership organization that leverages the talents and resources of Silicon Valley's leaders and social innovators to create a difference in the community and in our world. SV2 is building a welcoming group of active, socially responsible community members who believe in the power of creating impact together and learning by doing, challenging themselves to expand their knowledge, enhance their skills, and broaden their perspectives, all of which, as you can also see, require really high quality listening. So with those introductions to Ajay and David and Synergos and SV2, I thought we might dive right into conversation. So Ajay, I'm going to start with you. And I'd like to ask you kind of what's your philosophy on listening? And you can go from that self level that I started out talking about all the way to the organizational level at Synergos or other organizations you've been with, and the systems that enable or empower people to listen. And then what are some examples that you could share with us where you've seen listening play out in your work?
Thank you, Lindsay. I was just wanted to start by expressing my gratitude for being here with all of you. And it's rooms like this that give me a lot of hope for what the future of the world could look like. And so to your question, meaningful change starts with inquiry. One sees the world and they feel something isn't right. And they start to ask this question of why is this like this and what can be done about it and who can do something about it? And that leads us to questions that we have to listen very carefully in order to find the answers to. And so listening deeply, as you said in your introduction here, on 2 levels. One, listening to oneself, understanding what is it within me that's helpful to driving this sort of change, and what is it within me that can be a hindrance to driving this sort of change. And then secondly, and equally as important, is listening to others. The best teachers I've ever had in my life, the most wise people I've ever met, are the ones who focus on how little they know rather than how much they know. And that's an act of humility. And so listening requires that sort of humility. And I'll say that listening isn't just an activity of the ears, it's actually an activity of the heart. And more specifically, it's an activity of a trusting heart. And even more specifically, dare I say it, because we're here speaking about philanthropy, it's the activity of a loving heart. And so, in order to change systems, you have to change organizations. And in order to change organizations, you have to change oneself and change those within the system. And that takes a great deal of trust. So our organization was founded 37 years ago by Peggy Delaney, and she worked with her father, David Rockefeller, and she observed that he had a very unique ability, whether it was in business or diplomacy or philanthropy. He was able to bring together diverse groups of people to have open discussions, sometimes even people who are in conflict with one another, to have deep, meaningful conversations about how to solve the problem. And so this gave birth to Synergos as an organization, but more specifically to our methodology known as bridging leadership. And we've seen over the last 3 decades, or almost 4 decades now, the impact of bridging leadership, which is a methodology that builds trust for collective action. And we've seen, and we believe, that this is a sort of leadership that we need in today's day and age to solve the most complex problems that we're facing, because in order to solve them, it will require bringing multiple stakeholders together from all levels of society. Because it was up to one actor alone, we would have solved these problems already. So clearly that's not the case. And so bridging leadership is built on a foundation of deep listening, and it has 3 components to it. The first one often beginning with inner work, reflective practices. One way that we can approach this question is, how do we hone our ability as listeners, is to also understand what is holding me back from being a good listener. And as we all know, we come into this world and we go through certain experiences that give us acquired tendencies, acquired prejudice. We start to see the world through a particular perspective. And oftentimes that may not be the right perspective. Not that it's the wrong perspective, but it's just one perspective. And to get a holistic view, one has to understand what is holding me back. And whether it's my traumas, in psychology, they talk about this idea of shadow work. What have I put in, what is in my shadow that stops me from being a good listener, that stops me from being trusting, stops me from having the ability to be humble and vulnerable? Because also within listening, humility is a required component. Because if I think I know everything, I may sit there and I could listen to you all day, but I may not hear a word of what you're actually trying to say. And so with Bridging Leadership, we often start with this inner reflection, inner practices, inner work, to build personal alignment, which allows us to build trust with others and to others to trust us. And so that's part of listening to oneself. The second component is systems change, systems thinking. Systems are made up of individuals, and each individual has a unique part within a system. And one of our friends at the Presencing Institute, I heard him say, you cannot change a system without changing the consciousness of those within the system. And so with a systems thinking approach, it's very important that we listen to all of the stakeholders that are existing within that system if we really want to drive meaningful change there. So once we start to do that, what we then come to is the third component of Bridging Leadership, which is collaboration. We come to this understanding through our listening to ourselves, through listening to the stakeholders within the system, that in order for us to make a difference here, we have to come together, we have to work together, we have to ultimately bridge across divides. And so that results in a collaboration that's built on trust, which becomes even more meaningful and powerful in terms of listening. And so one example that I'll just share with you very briefly, and I find for myself, the simple examples sometimes are often the most meaningful. And so from Ethiopia, we have work that we do across the world that just briefly, we serve and support networks. And one of the networks that we support is a global philanthropist network. So these are philanthropists all over the world who we bring together for greater collaboration and greater impact. Another network that we support are civil society leaders, again, in a global context. And the third network that we support is a social entrepreneurs network. And so these different constituent groups, different stakeholders, we bring them together through this methodology of Bridging Leadership to build trust and to create collaborative efforts and action to drive change in the world. So in Ethiopia, we work with the government and we work with particularly smallholder farmers in agriculture. It's a very simple example that I'll share, but there was a great conflict within some farmers. So you have the herders who have their animals who need to graze, and then you have the farmers who are growing food. And this conflict arose in which oftentimes the herders would let their animals out and they would come into the growers' fields and they would decimate whatever was there. And, to us in the West, it may sound like a very small thing, but I've been to places like this, and this is not a small thing at all. This is someone's livelihood. This is their life's work. And so it became a very heated conflict with violence and other things. Now, our colleague there, who's a very amazing human being who spent, I believe, over 10 years in solitary confinement during the Civil War, who's come out as an absolutely amazing agent of change in the world. He went into that community and he spoke to both groups. And he didn't go in with any agenda. He didn't go in with any solution already preconceived. He just went in there to listen to them. And so he listened to the farmers and their plight, and he listened to the herders and their plight. And over time, what happened was, just because he sat there and he listened to, he gave them the space, and without his preconceived notion of what should be done, he just listened to them. What he came to do is build trust amongst both groups. And a solution arose, which was quite unique. Now, during the off season, the way that we do agriculture today, it takes nutrients out of the soil, and often we don't replenish those nutrients. So during the kind of season where the fields are barren, what's really helpful is to sow cover crops. They fix the nutrients back into the soil. But then for the farmer, it becomes another endeavor. You have to now remove that cover crop because you don't really harvest it or sell it. So what came about was a partnership, a collaboration, that the farmers would allow the herders to come onto their land during this season so that their animals could graze, which would make the farmer's life easier. also, what goes in has to come out. And so those animals then also replenish the soil through that method. And so what was a point of conflict now became a point of partnership and collaboration. And everyone was better off because of that. And how did that happen? It happened because there was one person from our team who was there, who just went in there just to listen to people. We didn't think we were going to solve a problem. We didn't want to, step on anyone's toes in any way. We didn't think we had the solution. What we knew was, if we just listen to people and build trusting relationships, everything else will emerge from that. And so the foundation, my personal philosophy in life is that relationships make the world move around. And relationships are built on listening. If I can't listen to you, actually, we have no relationship. It's superficial at best. And so within the philanthropic context, we are driven, hopefully, by our desire to make the world a better place because we actually have love in our hearts. And because we have love in our hearts, that means we want to have deep relationships with one another. Because if I can understand you and you can understand me, even if we have differences, we can find the ways that we can bridge things together to make the world better for everyone else. So those are a few words on that.
Oh my goodness, Ajay. Sarah, I hope that there's a digest or a recording because I need to listen to Ajay 2 or 3 more times. There were so many just nuggets of insight in there, Ajay, and things that we can remember as people doing this work and as humans in the world. And your closing point there about relationships make the world go round, I'm going to use and cite you in the future because I think that's deeply true. And they are based on trust, at least good ones that are more likely to lead us to success and to equity in our work. And you sometimes hear the phrase, or I don't know who to attribute it to, things move at the speed of trust. So I think both, relationships make the world go round and things can happen at the speed of trust. And that's a really nice segue to David, because David and SV2 are building a community of people based on relationships and trusting relationships between donors, nonprofits, and community members in the Northern California Bay Area region and Silicon Valley, and doing that really masterfully with listening at the center of the work. So David, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. Could you share your philosophy and approach to listening and examples from SV2 and your career as well?
Absolutely. Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks so much for having me. It's great to be on this panel with Ajay and with all of you. So for those who don't know, SV2 is a community of everyday givers who come together to connect, learn, and practice together. There are 3 main parts to our work: grant making, impact investing, immersive learning. And we recently completed a comprehensive strategic plan, which was really all about listening and the importance of listening to community voices in all aspects of our work. Some of the key principles in the plan were to be equity-centered, community-focused, with a real commitment to sharing power. And so it's not just listening to voices, but it's actually acting on and sharing power with the voices that you're listening to as an organization. So when we talked about sharing power, we realized we really needed to start by walking the walk. And where is the legal power in a nonprofit? It's on the board of directors. So our board historically has been made up solely of our donor partners. We do have a great diverse board. It's majority BIPOC and over 80% female. But we didn't have socioeconomic diversity on our board because all of our board members were donor partners. So one of the first things we did coming out of our strategic plan is we added 3 executive directors from our grantee partner organizations to our board of directors. And that has made an enormous difference. We wanted to make sure not to just have 1 or 2 where it would be easy to be tokenized and could be challenging to feel comfortable in the role, to have 3 folks who came in together as a cohort, 3 remarkable women of color who have brought their lived experience to our board of directors and have given us strategic insights that have greatly increased our effectiveness as a board, as an organization. And also for me personally, have been people that I've really relied on a one-to-one basis to offer amazing advice and support. So that is one big change that we made on our board of directors. We also, when we looked at our grant making, traditionally, all the decisions were made, again, by our donor partners in concert with staff. And so our donor partners would engage in what we call a grant round, research different organizations, and ultimately vote on where that funding should go. we had the opportunity to do the biggest grant initiative we've ever done, which we're calling our community initiative. We wanted to spend down some of the reserves that we had and get that money out into the community. And to do that, we had a different approach, which again involved listening to community voices. So instead of just having our donor partners make that decision, we had some donor partners at the table with staff, but we also had, again, community leaders and executive directors from our grantee partners on a core team of 10 people. Community and SV2 folks had equal votes overall. So really sharing power on that core team. That core team worked very intensively for about 8 months to research various initiatives, to eventually narrow it down to 3 and eventually select one. Sharing power in that way made the process so much more effective and so much deeper than any process I've been a part of, and all the other participants felt the same way. And then the outcome was also fantastic because we have a wonderful new grantee partner in Redwood City Together, which is a youth and community serving agency in Redwood City here in the Bay Area. Another way we are listening and sharing power is that partnership with Redwood City Together. We have an annual event called our Spring Gathering that is, again, usually driven by our donor partners and kind of set up in a certain way. For our kickoff, we wanted to invite Redwood City Together to co-create an event for us, which would be kind of our public kickoff of our new partnership. We had it a couple of weeks ago at a community center in Redwood City, and it was fantastic. We had over 150 people there. About half were SV2 donor partners and affiliated folks, and about half were Redwood City community members and leaders. And it was an incredible mix, and many of our longtime partners were so excited about the evolution of what SV2 is doing by co-creating this with the community. It had a completely different feel and had a deeper level of learning for our donor partners, and in all directions. Just a couple other points I'll make about what we're doing organizationally to listen. We actually created a new position called Director of Community Engagement, whose main job is to be out engaging and listening to the community. We have a wonderful leader in that space, a change maker named Amy Badiani. She does a fantastic job, and she really helps us build deep trust, which is something Ajay really spoke about, with our grantee partners in a way that wouldn't be possible if we didn't have someone whose entire job was really focused on that in community engagement. And so that is something we did structurally to make sure that we are prioritizing the voices of our grantee partners, even after the grant making process is over. And then finally, one of the main things we heard from grantees and applicants was how important it was to have unrestricted multi-year funding. We were already moving in that direction, but now every single one of our grants is a multi-year unrestricted grant, and that came directly from listening to the community, and it comes directly from our trust-based approach. We know that the folks closest to the problems are the ones who are going to know how to best use the resources. It's not our job to say how to use the resources. Our job is to get the resources in an unrestricted way. And by making it multi-year, it's not something that then immediately needs to be replaced, but there can be greater long-term thinking and greater understanding of what future resources will be available. So unrestricted multi-year funding is really key to what we do. That's all on an organizational level. And I'll close that, of course, as has been said, organizations are made out of individuals. And so we really need to learn to listen at an individual level. And mindfulness is a big part of SV2 in our DNA. I personally am a longtime meditation practitioner. We have a weekly free meditation open to anybody every Monday at noon, every other week. I lead it. Haru Desai, one of my partners, leads it as well on the other weeks. And it's something that has been wonderful to open up to the community. And we really try to take that approach in everything we do, to be on an individual level when we're in any meeting, but certainly meeting with the community, really checking in with ourselves, being present and listening deeply to what is happening, not trying to think about what we're going to say, what our response is going to be, what our ideas are, but simply to listen. And I think the example that Ajay told was a wonderful story that really shows the power of deep listening without trying to solve, without trying to fix, just trying to understand, and how much benefit that can lead to in the world. So those are some of the things that SV2 is doing, Lindsay.
Oh, I was muted. Incredible, David. Two quick things, and then Ajay, I'm coming back to you in a second. So get your unmute finger ready. One is I just wanted to hold up a comment that just came in the chat from Isis. Love the focus on structural changes. It reminds me of what Dr. Kendi talked about yesterday in the keynote and the differences between individual and structural changes. Both are needed. Ways to be better listeners personally and also make listening a systemic practice. So I think you really both emphasized that. And I am thrilled that that is showing up perhaps as a theme at this conference, because it is in some ways the maybe mundane everyday part of our work. And yet I think, as you've both highlighted really beautifully, it's also kind of the fabric and fuel on which the work happens. David, one other thing I just wanted to ask you, since we're on topic, and then I'm going to ask you each one more question before we open it up to the group. And that is, Beverly asked about just if you could offer maybe a minute of color on the criteria for how you thought about the nonprofit leaders to add. Were there, issues with others not being selected or invited? Just maybe the short version on that. And if people want to know more, we can come back in the Q&A.
Sure. Thanks, Lizzie. And that is a great question, Beverly. We tried to be very, very thoughtful about it and to work with some of our grantee partners who were already engaged with us in different ways. And so, for example, Dr. Linda Prieto, the executive director of Upward Scholars, she was on our core team for the community initiative that I just spoke about. And then after that joined our board. And so we had different ways for people to get engaged. And then from the folks who were most engaged, that's how we figured out who would be invited on the board. And so it was really folks who we had developed a deep trust with through our 3-year grant making cycle, as well as for working with us on other activities outside of our grant making relationship as well.
Super. Thank you, David. So, I think we can learn from the, sort of philosophies and approaches and tenets of the work, and from these really positive examples. And this is obviously hard to do. I think people often sort of say, if something were easy, everybody would be doing it. And there's some cliche in that, but it's also true. And so I was hoping that I could ask you, Ajay, and then David, I'll follow with you. What are some of the challenges, the hurdles, and the pain points have been in doing high quality listening? And excuse me, I don't ask to dissuade anyone. Of course, I need a beverage, right, as I'm asking the question. I don't ask to dissuade, but rather to take those as learning opportunities, and also kind of things that others can use if they're encountering similar hurdles to try to overcome them. Ajay.
Thank you, Lindsay. I think there's two things that we can consider here in terms of hurdles and pain points. One being on the practical level, and I think there's another aspect which is a more philosophical inquiry. And those who know me well know I tend to lean towards the philosophical. So this time I'm going to start with the practical and see where we end up. But on the practical side, I think there's two components that we can look at: personal challenges and hurdles, and then contextual challenges and hurdles. So on the personal side, I think there can be a great deal of fear and distrust, because deep listening requires, as David spoke about and we've been speaking about so far this morning, a certain degree of humility. And being humble is a very vulnerable position to put oneself in. And we're not taught to be humble in today's day and age, because we're taught that you should have all the answers, you should be strong. But in the case of listening in particular, knowing that you don't know all that much, while most people may see that as a weakness, is actually your greatest strength, because it opens you up. It opens you up to be present in the moment. It stops you thinking about all the things that you think you know and all the experiences you've had of the past. And it stops you projecting into the future with all of the solutions. It keeps you right here in this moment with an open heart and an open mind to hear what's coming to you, to receive the gifts that are being given to you. So I think the distrust, we live in a very polarized world in this day and age. I'll give a short story here around trust, particularly of those, who, if you have resources, it can become very difficult to discern who's coming to you for what. So in a previous life, I was running a foundation, and we were pioneers in what we were doing at the time. And I'd moved to a particular area, and someone on our board knew someone who lived in that same neighborhood and said, "Oh, you should meet my friend so-and-so." And so they introduced me. I went to meet this particular person. And for the first 5 minutes of our meeting, this person just sat rigid. It's fully locked, in this really I had to stop the conversation and say, is everything okay? And his immediate response was, I don't want to give you money. And I was a little bewildered at this point. And he thought that, my board member had connected me to him because I was coming there to ask him for a donation. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not here for your money. I'm just here to get to know you. And so there's this distrust that we can have, particularly when you have resources, because, it's not inconceivable to think that sometimes people are coming to you with all sorts of ulterior motives and intentions. And so you have to be able to discern that. I think that can be a personal hurdle. Another one just on the other side, which I think is also important to consider, is overconfidence is also a bit of a hurdle. Generally, if we've been successful in other arenas or other areas of our lives, in other endeavors, other domains, we think that we are experts, rather than thinking that I was very good at thing X. I just start to think I'm very good. And so then I begin to, rather than be humble when I'm speaking to someone, I already think I know what you're talking about. I already know the answer. I'm just going to entertain you and wait for my turn now to speak. And again, I think that's a personal hurdle. And a lot of our inner work practices that we talk about through Bridging Leadership are there to address these things. Because oftentimes what you'll find, these things are not done necessarily intentionally. They really come from an insecurity that we may have, some trauma we went through, some experiences that we've had in our lives that now we overcompensate for by trying to be the strong one, by trying to be the one who has all the answers, and so on and so forth. Because society hasn't necessarily taught us that it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to not know anything. It's okay to have humility and vulnerability. And when you offer that to someone else, what you do is you open the door for them to also be authentic and vulnerable and humble with you. And in that arena, two people may not have the answers individually, but more likely than not, if you come together with that sort of a heart and that sort of a mindset, an answer will arise. So I think that's the personal side. And then on the contextual side, which relates to our systems thinking within Bridging Leadership, there's a desire oftentimes for immediate results. And so rather than taking the time to listen, we impose our own beliefs on stakeholders or donors or grantees or whatever it may be, because we just want a result. We want to see some action here and we want to see impact, rather than taking time to understand there may be a longer lasting impact if we go about this a little slower and actually open our ears rather than looking at a spreadsheet and the data points. And so I think that means that we have to overcome this lack of mutual understanding that can be there. And there can also be a denial and avoidance of the issues of power and conflict, as we've spoken about. And so I think a recognition that you have power, but power comes along with responsibility. There's that great saying. And so rather than leaning on the power part, I think we have to lean on the responsibility part that we all have, that we've been given great gifts, whether it's our ability, whether it's our finances, whatever it may be. We all have resources at our disposal that can be utilized for the benefit of the world and for the benefit of others. And by not doing so, we are no longer living into the responsibility that comes along with those gifts that we've been given. That kind of leads me to the more philosophical point, which I think becomes the whole conversation in and of itself, but I'll just spark something for you all to think about, if you like, which is, it's also an issue of definitions. Here we're talking about power dynamics, but how do you define power? An organization has money. Is that what makes them powerful? If anything, the opportunity to serve is the most powerful thing. And so when we think about these things, I think we have to start redefining who's powerful within the equation. Is it the person who has the most dollars, or is it the person who has the most heart in the thing? And it could be the same person who has the most heart and also has the most dollars. But I do think that philosophically, we have to start looking at this understanding of power and who has power and privilege. Because sometimes, and I've had this experience, and I've said this quite candidly to someone I used to work with, who grew up with a lot of resources, and was talking about his privilege. And I said, actually, your privilege is your greatest hindrance. You're seeing it as a privilege. I think it's robbed you of something even more meaningful. It's robbed you from the ability to really connect with people. It's robbed you of the ability to really be to have empathy for people. And so on a philosophical level, I think one of the hurdles that we see with listening is, I think we have to start redefining who has the power. The person on the ground who's closest to the issue, as David said, they have the real power here because they're closest to the solution too. I can support them and I can serve them. So I think what we have to do is we have to start switching our mindset a little bit and start to adopt more of a service attitude rather than this attitude of, we are the ones who are giving you the resources to solve your problems. No, not at all. They're giving us an opportunity to be part of a solution and a small part at that, because the financial aspect is just a small aspect in solving anything. So anyway, philosophically, I could go on for the rest of the evening, but I won't.
And I wish you would. And we have, more things to cover, but your points are so well taken, Audrey. Thank you. And, I think when you have this, I believe when we have this conversation about power, we're having an equity conversation, right? And so I know that term gets used a lot in the sector now, especially, and in ways that are often important, but maybe sometimes also kind of lip service to the issue. And if you find yourself on this call wondering ever, what does this person mean by centering equity? What did I mean in my introduction by centering equity? And in large part, I meant this power analysis that Ajay was just offering, in terms of, in any situation, looking at who has power and how am I defining power and how does that power operate? And I do think that the financial aspect is just one part. And in my experience, it's often, though, a gating part at the beginning. And I do find that you can build different relationships once the financial aspect is handled in some ways. But I also don't want to minimize that at the front end of something, it can be really important. So with that, David, I'd like to turn to you for kind of the challenges, hurdles, pain points that you've experienced with this, that we might learn something from, might help others who are trying to implement these things. For example, I don't know if you'll talk about it, but I'm sure that it feels in some ways like such a simple and important and beautiful change to change the board composition. And yet I imagine that the millions of details, both to make that change happen and to implement it well day to day. Now, it's not like, oh, great, we added them to the board, we're done here, right? So I don't know if you're going to touch on that one or not, but it was occurring to me as you did it. I bet there were some challenges and hurdles along the way with that one. So I'd like to ask you to answer that. And then folks, get your question typing hands, voices, however you're putting them in the chat ready, because then Sarah and I will turn to those and get to as many of them as we can with Ajay and David before our session time closes. David?
Yes, thanks, Lindsay. So yes, in terms of the board, we tried to be very intentional about onboarding our new board members in a way that would make it as smooth as possible for everybody involved. So from lots of one-on-one meetings with me and with our board chair, but also we had like an informal lunch before the first board meeting that almost everybody came to, so that people could get to know each other socially. So the first time meeting each other wasn't in this like official board setting. And it's also just been like lots of check-ins all the way through to make sure that everything is going as smoothly as possible. So you're absolutely right. It's not like, oh, the appointment's been made, all set, nothing to worry about now. We tried to be really, really intentional so that it all went as smoothly as possible. And we're really fortunate that it has gone really well. Another challenge is just really understanding that if you want to do this listening in a real way, there will be discomfort and disagreement, and you have to be okay with that. An example is on the core team for the community initiative that I talked about earlier. The 10 of us became very close and had a very trusting environment. And because we built that, we were able to have some serious disagreements about certain things. And there was discomfort. There, in an hour-long meeting, there could be 10 or 15 minutes where things were felt a little bit tense because everybody was feeling comfortable and trusting to say what they really thought and to disagree with each other. And what's the point of doing this if you don't create that safe space for people to do it? And each time we came out the other end, more trusting, more cohesive, more aligned with the direction we were going, because people didn't hold back. People were really ready to go into that discomfort and disagreement. And I think that's something you have to accept is going to be part of the process, or else it's not really happening. Also, to do this in a real way, understanding that things will be different. The example I gave about our Spring Connection event, that had been done for many, many, many years in a certain way that everybody really liked. There was no need to change it. People loved our Spring Connections. But we thought it would be interesting to co-create it with the community, and it had a completely different feel. And there was some risk of how would our folks who are used to coming to this event every year and expecting a certain thing, how would they respond? And so we, again, had to be comfortable with that discomfort of not knowing what that response would be. We were very hopeful that people would think it was a wonderful evolution. And that is, in fact, the feedback that we've received. People really, really appreciated it. But we didn't know that beforehand. And so we had to be comfortable doing things in a different way. And the last thing I'll say, to do this in a real way, you really have to acknowledge that when you're bringing folks together who aren't used to being in community together, there's potential harm that could happen, by well-meaning donors. And that if and when that happens, really the need organizationally to name it and to own it and to make amends is crucial. Sometimes those missteps can actually, again, lead to greater trust in the long run, because when people see how we respond to the missteps and take responsibility for them, then that increases the trust, so people are willing to go deeper. And that's definitely something that we found in this process, and realizing that we're all human, we all make mistakes are going to be made. It's how do you respond to those mistakes after they're made? And if you do it in a way that builds trust, that only makes things stronger in the long run. And what happened ends up looking like a small hiccup in retrospect, and something that actually was part of the journey to getting to fuller trust. So those are some of the challenges and how we've dealt with them. And I look forward to hearing other questions that arise.
Lots of energy in the chat for both of you as you've been talking. I know it can be hard as a speaker to also track that, but lots of conversation happening about how important those times of disagreement are, especially with the conditions of trust in place. And I've often reflected on the fact that, having a thought or somebody else having one and having it go unexpressed is actually not the way to build trust. And exactly to your point, how people handle those hard situations, and even going through the shared experience together of the hard situation, I think has at least the potential to build trust if you show up with the humility and the empathy and the openness that David, you and Ajay both talked about. Okay, folks, I appreciate so many of you so active in the chat. What questions do you have for Ajay and David, or additional things that you'd like them to reflect on? The floor is open. Yeah, and Sarah's making the point of getting training around handling conflict. Absolutely. In fact, I have a book, I think it's buried in my library pile here, but I have a book that my team has used. It is hardly the only model. We shouldn't overprivilege Harvard, but difficult conversations. I've worked on teams and I found this one really helpful. So that's one recommendation from my library book pile. Okay, we have a question coming in. I don't know, Ajay or David, if this is a big one in some ways, but how do you deal with someone who just doesn't listen or isn't self-aware? What are ways to handle that? And also, is listening more of an art or a science? You can take both. Well, Ajay, you want to start?
Sure, I can start. On the first question, how do you deal with someone who just doesn't listen, isn't self-aware? I had a teacher once who told me you should see everything in the world as an act of love or a call for love. And so I try to have as much compassion as possible. But I also am very practical as a human being. And if I'm hitting my head against a brick wall, at some point I stop hitting my head. And you're not going to agree with everyone. I think this is also an important aspect that we should understand about trust. Sometimes we think that trust means, we're going to come to an agreement. I can only trust the people I agree with. Or somehow I'm going to change your mind, you're going to change my mind. But actually, trust can also be there amongst people who you don't agree with. And I'll give a really small story. About 5 years ago, I had a terrible car accident and I broke my neck and back. And I was told, you'll never walk again. I showed them because I can. But anyway, as a side note there, and I had a neighbor, and the only thing he and I connected on is I had a dog and he had a dog, and they were very similar, and the dogs really loved each other. And we disagree on everything. You think of any issue in the world, he and I probably are polar opposites on that issue. But when I was in that condition, he came to my house every morning. He picked up my dog. He took my dog for the whole day. He would take it for a walk in the morning. He'd keep it with him. He'd feed the dog. He'd walk the dog in the evening, and he'd bring the dog back at night. And he did this every single day. And I trusted him completely, even though I disagreed with him on every single issue that we could ever conceive of. Why? Because while I didn't agree with him, I didn't dislike him. I didn't hate him. I could see him as a human being. I could see his perspective, even if I didn't agree with his perspective. So that's just a story to kind of illustrate, even if someone doesn't listen, you know, what can you do? You can't change everyone, but what I can do is change myself, and I can change my reaction. So that's some thoughts on that question. David, maybe I'll leave the other question to you.
Sure thing. Thanks, Ajay. And the question is listening more in art or science? And I think it's both. I think there's a science in there are techniques you can use to improve your listening skills, but ultimately it's an art because it's about being present in the moment and how you respond in that moment to what you're hearing. It all comes down to being present and aware, and fully receiving. Deep listening is you are just completely focused on taking in what the other person is saying. So often in our society, in almost any conversation, we're kind of listening, but we're also thinking about what we're going to say back and how smart we're going to sound and the point we're going to make and how we're going to push the conversation forward, or another question we want to ask because we're not as interested in what they're saying right now and we'd rather they go in a different direction. So I think the art is getting all that out of our mind and just fully being present and paying attention. And when we do that, what we take in is so much deeper and can be felt by the person who is speaking, which builds that trust as well. Because it's really rare in life that someone is really, truly, deeply listening to us. And there are exercises you can do to kind of build that muscle. And so, again, I would say it's both science and art, but the art part is a really, really key part as well.
Thank you. And lots of good resources happening in the chat here. We have time for just a quick final answer if either of you have one. And then Sarah, I'm going to hand it to you to close out. And please, as part of closing, let us know how we can see these notes and re-listen, because I am definitely on the list for that. And just huge thanks to everyone for your engagement in the chat. A related question to earlier where someone asked about, what if someone won't listen? Here we have a situation of, maybe it's a similar situation of handling someone who wants credit, a supervisor in this case who wants credit without acknowledging staff and volunteers. But I think you could draw even a bigger parallel to, say, a funder that wants credit when, to your point, Ajay, like the power is in the community. So any closing reflections on that question of kind of ego, I guess?
Well, ego is definitely something that we all have to battle with. And I think there's two things that one has to consider, right? One is, am I here for the impact, or am I here for the credit? And I think both are nice. I think it's always, what is credit ultimately? When someone wants to be credited for something, what are we actually trying to ask for? What we're asking for is someone to see the value in what I'm doing, right? And oftentimes, the credit isn't the thing. Someone patting you on the back and saying thank you isn't really what you're after. What you're after is that someone recognized that I did something of value. I had value that I've enacted in this thing. And, without knowing the particulars of the circumstances of your supervisor or anything of that nature, what I would say is, one has to take personal inventory of, is this something I can let go of just because the work is meaningful? Or is this something that it bugs me, it gets under my skin? And why does it get under my skin? And I'm sure in most organizations, there are processes by which one could speak to others in the organization to point out, perhaps it's a blind spot of the supervisor, perhaps it's not even an intentional thing. And are there ways that we can help support one another to be better listeners and to be better colleagues and to be better human beings, even if someone is my supervisor? We're all human beings at the end of the day, and we all have our blind spots and shortcomings as well. And so not to minimize what the question is aiming for. But I'm sure there are processes and procedures within your organizations that you could use. And I think community is the most important thing. So your peers and your colleagues and your teammates may be a good resource for you to address this. So
helpful, Ajay. Gosh, friends, I wish that this session were more than 50 minutes. Sarah, bring us home for today. And I hope that this can be a follow-up webinar conversation. I think there's so much more to dig into here, and it's something we're really committed to at Fund for Shared Insight. So if there's more conversation you want to have, please reach out to me. I'd certainly welcome that. David, Ajay, thank you for your incredible work on this and your leadership today. Sarah, bring us home.
You bet. Lindsay, do you want to put your email? Do you want to be bold and put your email in the chat if people want to follow up?
Yeah,
Up to you.
sure.
And I think many of us just want to listen to Ajay's voice. So if you have recordings, Ajay, somewhere in the stratosphere, I think many of us would. Maybe it's all those years as a monk. So thank you so much. And thank you, David. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, all of you. We appreciate your valuable insights, the deep conversation, and I think some of the real authentic feelings that came up for folks as they listen to all of you, as reflected in the chat. I think this has been one of the more deeper sessions that I've had the pleasure of being part of here at We Give. And so I really appreciate everybody's authenticity and trust. So in the next few days, you can find a recording of today's session. And as you can see, the closing poll has already popped back up. And there's a raffle winner, but I don't know who it is. So if some awesome person on the team can pop it in the chat, that would be fantastic. Thank you again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at more sessions today. And please join us for our next session on unlocking finance. Maybe like me, it's another area where we can gain some skills or polish up what we might already know. I've been told, and I expect that this will be another candid conversation on impact investing and collective action. So it starts in about 8 minutes at the top of the hour. Yes, so Yven's Rumbold is the raffle winner, and I am so sorry if I did not pronounce your first name correctly. We will be in touch with you, and you can pick a book from one of our speakers. Thank you again so much. We'll see you at the next session, Unlocking Finance. Take care.